Have you wondered recently whether you're on track for retirement or other financial goals? Like, are your kids set up for financial success? Ty Nafziger from Benjamin F. Edwards & Company is hosting a 30-minute seminar to help you answer these questions and more. Ty's goal is to help families feel confident in their financial plan. So join Ty at the seminar on September 11th at 2 p.m. at the Monona Library in the Municipal Room downstairs. And kids are welcome. Benjamin F. Edwards & Company is a member SIPC. Y'all, Comic-Con is back in Madison. Meet your favorite celebs and see all the cool artists and vendors at Madison Comic Expo on September 14th and 15th at the Alliant Energy Center. Meet the voice of SpongeBob, Tom Kenny, as well as Rachel Lee Cook, Will Friedle, Grace Van Dien, some Power Rangers, and over a dozen voice actors from your favorite cartoons and anime. Don't miss the costume contest on Saturday and Sunday. Buy your tickets now at MadisonComicExpo.com. Today on CityCast Madison. Did you hear about the abrupt closing of the popular restaurant group Robinia Courtyard back in May? Robinia was well-loved and unique for a number of reasons, including its one kitchen serving 3 concept restaurants. And it was one of Madison's few late-night food spots with the bonus of a gorgeous outdoor courtyard. But unfortunately, Robinia closed on account of unpaid debts, and many of their workers and vendors are still waiting to be paid. So what happened? Lindsay Christians, food editor at the Cap Times, just released a deeply reported article on the closure. We sat down with her to get the story. It's Thursday, September 5th. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Hey, Lindsay.
Hello.
So, we've got a tricky story to talk about today, a tough story. A beloved restaurant cafe compound on East Washington closed its doors, and to some surprise, Robinia. So first as context, what is Robinia Court?
So Robinia Courtyard was built in 2014 and opened in 2015 as 3 linked but distinct concepts. So originally it was Julep, which is a southern restaurant in the very back area there. There was a wine bar that I still miss called Barolo in the middle. And then there was a coffee shop in the front. I believe it was called A-OK. And that was run by the Kin folks. There were, I think, 9 partners in these 3 separate projects with one kitchen serving all of them. And it was difficult because this was 2015 and it was before East Wash had really started to grow. Yeah, blown up, right? Which it really has since then. So after about a year, they didn't have enough money to sustain it through the rough times when not as many people were coming in, like in winter and that kind of thing. They just didn't have enough capital. They were undercapitalized as a project. And so most of the partners left. John Reske from 4Cap Real Estate stayed on. He's still a partial owner. And he found some new partners and he reopened the concepts with rebrand. So we had Jardine in the back, which has had several kind of iterations. Madison Tap, and now in the middle, that's a craft beer bar where like it kind of rotates different craft beer. For a while, they were doing pop-ups for different breweries each month where they would do a full takeover. And then in the front is Black Locust Cafe, which a lot of people love. It's a little coffee shop there in the front of East Wash. And through it all, the main draw of this project has been this 3,500 square foot courtyard, which is beautiful. It's got trees shading it. They have events out there all the time. They had like indie craft fairs and Latin dance nights, and they had fundraisers for local nonprofits and politicians, and it was just very active. I'm sure you've been to some stuff there, right?
Well, hilariously, it's not hilarious, but I haven't been back. I've been invited to go like salsa. Let's go learn salsa there. But I went to Julep back in the day and had been out on the courtyard. You know, that was the place to go.
Yeah, it really became a kind of a hotspot. They had late night. They were one of the few places doing late night. And they would get folks from, across the way at Brees, if there were concerts there. that's only been sort of the current concept at Jardine, the restaurant in the back, the fully plant-based vegan concept, for maybe a year and a half, I want to say. And that was under Chef Juan David Umania.
Yeah, so this is one of our food conversations. We're taking a little bit of a detour of just focusing on all the food, but we know you've covered Jardine, you've covered lots of the places that have been in the Robinia Courtyard, and Jardine really stood out because I think, from your article, it got more attention than maybe they even expected. Like it really shot up in notoriety because of the quality of their vegan food. And then this spring, all the doors were closed. And over the past few months, there have been rumblings online about the future or lack thereof of the restaurant. Finally, in May, a sign was posted on the door that said, Robinia Courtyard is closed for the time being. And you just wrote this big story that details all of the events that led up to the closure. So tell us what went wrong.
So I think the important thing to know is that John calls it a bootstrap project. And the property it's sitting on is worth millions, right? Like the way they've built it out. I don't want to guess at how many millions, but it's more than two, probably. So it's not like John doesn't have any equity. He does, but that's not liquid. He can't easily use that to pay his employees. So what ended up happening was they would be over budget. John says that the kitchen was not sustainable, that things were costing too much. My impression, having reported out this story, is that he agreed to some things maybe he shouldn't have agreed to. Like the rates of pay for some folks maybe were more than he could actually budget for. I know that he hired different chefs to come up with menus for Jardine, for example, before Juan took over. And those menus never saw the light of day. So there were a lot of things he was paying money out for that weren't coming back in any demonstrable way. I think it is important to note that a lot of people really enjoyed working at Robinia, even as their checks started to bounce, even as they weren't getting paid on time or the pay wasn't accurate. There were a lot of people that I talked to who were like, yeah, it was really fun. I got treated well. I liked working with Juan, or I liked working at the cafe. I would have loved to stay on, but you can't ask people to volunteer at their job, right?
Right.
So, but I heard about problems with on-time payment and bounce checks going back several years. It was many years. Yeah. So, and things would get better in the summertime. And, Juan mentioned that they would start to come out ahead. More people were coming. It's really beautiful in that courtyard. You want to be eating plant-based food. It's great. It's gorgeous. And then, as the weather got cooler, it got harder. And Juan was using really exceptional ingredients. He had a well-trained staff. It got difficult to sustain that when not as many people were coming in. John and I talked for about 90 minutes as part of the story just to get some of the context, because I had also talked with many, many of the employees who were just frustrated, saying, we haven't been paid. We would like to see our money for the work that we did. And he talked about how, for example, some of the more popular events wouldn't necessarily be moneymakers, because for a big dance night, maybe you have to shut down that stage area where they had people dine. People love to dine in that area. You had to shut that down early. You had to shut down the courtyard early, or people would come in and he'd be like, everybody was drinking water. So he's not making money off of it in the way that he would like to. He wanted to sort of make these events accessible, but at the same time, they weren't bringing in the kind of money, and they were losing them a night of service, dinner service. So my strong impression is that I wanted a friend of mine, there's a friend of mine who does restaurant consulting and comes in and says, okay, here's where you're wasting money. Here's where you can find efficiencies. Here's how you need to redo your business model to make sure that everybody gets paid. Because I think another big message of this piece is that it is irresponsible to keep running a business when you cannot pay your employees. For better, for worse, no matter what your intentions are, if you can't pay your employees, you can't be in business, because we are all working as best we can, and everybody's going to have rent and everybody's going to have bills to pay. And it is one thing to say, I understand that you had a really difficult year, and that is very true, but so did some of your employees.
So it sounds like the business picture has been kind of tenuous from the start. Like I mentioned, I'd been to Julep. Fantastic restaurant. I was like, this is my new favorite thing. And I could recognize it's not full.
Yeah.
Now jump ahead when we're looking at restaurant closures. You know, you and I talk about this all the time, but restaurants, they come and they go. But this is this major complex that's beloved. Everyone's talking about Robinia Courtyard. And for it to go was really shocking, I guess, at this point. You know, the pandemic had such an impact on so many different restaurants. We lost lots of restaurants and places that we loved. Does that have anything to do with this picture, or is this just a tale of mismanagement in business?
I think the pandemic did have an effect in terms of how much people expected to be paid for their labor, because a lot of the industry folks were coming back and being like, you know, you can't pay me nothing anymore. You know, you have to actually pay me for my work and for my skill. So that labor costs have certainly gone up. There were some real challenges in the labor pool. You know, every restaurant talked about turnover. And so when you're constantly having turnover and having to retrain people, that is a factor for sure. I know that Robinia was, interestingly, one of the very first in like 2019 to have those dome pop-up things. Like they're
protective.
Globe. Yeah.
So you don't have to be engaging your germs with others.
Right.
Just your little pod.
They had snow globes, and I think they were charging a couple $100 for them to like reserve them for like a couple of hours at the very beginning, because nobody else had them, and they were like this cool thing.
It was novel. I'm like, they were everywhere in Chicago.
Yeah, they were. And then I heard different things from different people. Some of the employees said that those were really underutilized in the following seasons. Like they could have done a lot more business out of those that they did not do because of how the online reservation system was set up. There were a lot of issues about that. One person said that he came in and set them up on his day off. And like, was he ever paid for that? You know, so, and then finding ways of kind of taking some of the pandemic changes or the pandemic adaptations and extending those, like going back to big dance nights. Like it took all of us a little time to want to do that.
Right.
And during the pandemic was when like the Moxie was starting to get built. Well, it finally got built and now it's right next door. And it was quiet during the pandemic. It's not quiet now, you know, then it wasn't quiet when late night came back finally really to Robinia. So I think there are those kinds of things that happened a little bit with it.
But talking to John, I didn't see that as much pop up in your story. Like the reasons, what you started to share, he had a really tough year. Or can you go into what, I don't want to make you say the one thing that closed the doors, but top three.
Yeah, I don't think there was one thing. I get the strong sense from John that like he was having difficulty because he had one of his parents pass away in the fall of this past year. His other parent passed away in February. He, as I said, his wife just had twins in May. And so he was just away from the restaurant a lot, which you have to be. Like if your parents are ill and if you have new babies at home, like you do have to be away. And I don't think there was anybody kind of running the ship at that point for whatever reason. And I think what ends up happening is you don't end up with $24,000 in debt to MG&E. You don't end up with like the Department of Revenue pulling your license to sell because of back taxes. Like again, over $20,000 of back taxes. That doesn't happen by accident. But if you are not, you know, John said he put in his own money, and I believe that. But again, if you're asking people to work and you are not sure if you're going to be able to pay them, a lot of restaurants do run on the margins, right? They run week to week sometimes. And ideally, you're able to come out of that after a little while, because otherwise it's not a sustainable place for anybody to work. And it is understandable to be frustrated that like, oh, you know, people were giving away drinks or whatever, and I'm upset with how my employees were behaving. But if you're not paying them, what is your motivation to treat the job with respect if you don't feel respected?
Red at the Bone, The Sixth Extinction, Le Petit Prince. Madison Public Library connects us to the world, to information, and to each other. And September is Library Card Sign-Up Month. So now's the perfect time to go find your newest fandom through books, movies, manga, music, and more when you get your very own Madison Public Library card. And this is fun. If you sign up in September at any of the 9 Madison Public Library locations, you can get your photo taken with a big library card. Hey, make it a celebration. Already have a card? Awesome. You can renew it this month and visit the library website for a list of 30 things you can do with your Madison Library card. One for every day in September. To get started, visit madpl.org. That's madpl.org. Or stop into any Madison Public Library location.
Hi, this is David, the CEO of CityCast. Do you ever find yourself holding back on travel because you're afraid of a language gap? Well, mind the gap no longer, as long as you have Babbel. Babbel is the science-backed language learning app. Its 10 minutes lessons are quick and handcrafted to get you talking your new language in 3 weeks. So I was reminded in the Olympics how much I love French. I had spoken French as a kid, but it has deteriorated to nothing. But I thought I would love to take a trip back to France with my girlfriend, but I'm embarrassed because my French is at 0. And I thought, why don't I get on Babbel and revive my French? And it's been a joy for the past few weeks. I'd forgotten everything. I'd forgotten plurals. I'd forgotten articles, vocabulary. Mostly I'd just forgotten how to speak and how to listen. And Babbel has me back on track with lots of speaking and lots of listening, because that's how you get better at a language. So I've been working on time, for example. And there's this way in French where when you say 2:45, you don't say 2:45, you say 3 o'clock minus 15. So, je rentre à 3h moins le quart. I'm coming back at 2:45. Anyway, it's so much fun to speak. And don't take my word for it. There's studies from Yale, from Michigan State University that prove that Babbel works. So, here's a special limited time deal for CityCast listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/citycast. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/citycast. Spelled BABBEL.com/citycast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
As someone who spends a lot of time in different restaurants and bars, it's very common for bartenders to give drinks away to not just their friends, but to client people that are coming in as a part of a gesture, because people leave really big tips. So maybe that's not going back to the restaurant, but it's also they're bringing the people back. So, there are all these kind of nuances with that. And for the article, you did talk to at least 7 different workers about their experience in this. And as noted, I saw one quote that I feel horrible about the way this all went down. And like you said, that some people really enjoyed working there, that it wasn't this total hellscape. But the hellscape was, I'm not getting paid. So can you talk about what the sentiments folks shared? Like, is there an anger or sadness?
I would say anger or sadness, it kind of depended on the person. Some people were more angry than others. And I will also say I had a longer list of employees that I could have I contacted some who didn't get back to me, but then there were also 4 more that I was like, I have enough for the story. So there were more people who wanted to talk about their experiences than I even had room for. I was impressed by the level of empathy that many of them had. They're like, look, the restaurant business is hard. We get it. We've all had rough times. I think Simone Doing is a barista who was working at Black Locust Cafe. She's now working at Madison Sourdough, which is a union house. Yep. Important to note. So she talked about how she was running the cafe with this other coworker of hers, and she was effectively managing it, although she was not paid as a manager. And she felt really empowered. She was like, yeah, we're holding it down. We're doing great. This is, we're running this thing. And that felt really good. And then she would sort of pause and think, are we being exploited? That doesn't feel good. And she would, when she had a check bounce or a check not show up or something, she said she'd, get in touch with John and he would apologize and say, oh, there'll be a check there tomorrow. I'm so sorry. I got the sense from a lot of the employees that John was not responsive. Often they would eventually get paid later, not on their payday, but later. but that he was really avoiding having difficult conversations. And again, there's context for that. He was having a really rough year, but people weren't getting paid on time, and then they couldn't reach their boss to find out why.
Was this considered wage theft?
Yeah, I think every definition of wage theft, this fits. I will say more common in the restaurant industry, or what I hear about more often, is someone showing up for their prep shift an hour early or 2 hours early so that they're ready for service and not getting paid for those hours. Because when you start, you need to have your mise en place like ready. You need to have everything good to go. So when people are showing up early for their shift or working through breaks that they're allowed to have or they're entitled to, that's a form of wage theft. Other forms of wage theft that you'll sometimes hear are like, the restaurant isn't open yet. We need to do some construction and some work to get the inside ready. And so they'll have people that they've already hired come and do that work, and then they never see a check for that work, even though, because it's not fully running up yet. So that's a form of wage theft that you hear a lot. This is more, the state of Wisconsin requires that within 31 days of performing the work, if that's your regular pay schedule, that you need to be paid. So I cite the statute in the piece of what the state of Wisconsin requires, and Robinia is in violation of that, according to every employee I talk to. And only some have filed claims with like the Department of Workforce Development, Small Claims Court. Only some have filed claims. Even some of those, like there's a vendor who filed a claim and does not expect to see his money again, but he filed it hoping.
And the chef of Jardine, aren't they owed like $20,000?
Yeah, one says that he's owed about $20,000. That is above the high cap for small claims. So he's going to be getting a lawyer.
I saw one restaurant worker quoted in your story who said, I really want justice. Madison can hold people accountable for once in the restaurant world. Do you think there are any lessons that have been learned here from your time talking to the owner, John Ruskey, talking to other, employees and people impacted by these closures and these practices?
I think it was interesting from my perspective. I've done stories like this before. And my editor, Rob, was joking that he was relieved there wasn't any like assault and abuse in this one. I was like, oh God, yeah. The bar's so low. I think there is a gap between what you and I as diners understand about the restaurant industry and what people who work in it understand. I think there are practices in the industry that are accepted, even though they shouldn't be. And what I hope when I write a story like this is that workers will read it and feel empowered to advocate for themselves. Because if you are working at a job and you're not getting paid, that's not okay. And I don't care what the job is. And part of it is we're living in late capitalism, and late capitalism doesn't always have a lot of room for humanity as it intersects with business. But I can sort of hold both that John has good intentions and that he cares about at least some of his workers, and he wants to make a go of this thing, whether because he's invested a lot in it or because he has grander plans, and also say these people were harmed, that by not being paid for their labor, they are devalued, they have been disrespected, their anger is justified, their requests for compensation and for justice are valid, and that we can acknowledge that as diners who want to support restaurants that are treating their staff well, and also understand that these things are complicated. And there is no one reason for why something like this happens, but hopefully the message is advocacy. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't help but think, just having worked in the restaurant industry in Madison for years, that there's, and this also bleeds into other industries, but this idea that it's family. You're a part of a family. It's good. And also clientele. It gets really messy. And I think this is an example that we are not family. This is a contract, and this is my livelihood. And I have so much empathy for all of the people who had offered their goodwill in this situation. As someone who had a very difficult year last year and lost a parent and all of that, it can be totally debilitating. And there's family and there's business. So I just want to commend you as well to the empathy and of your reporting and how you've really shown the many components of this really complicated and messy picture in our small community. I mean, I'm sure it took a lot of effort. So thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think the next iteration of Robinia will be different. If they're able to reopen, I think it will look different. But I think John has some work to do to sort of repair the trust that he will need to be able to hire employees to work for him. Some assurance. One of the questions I had for him is, if you hire people and you reopen, what assurance do those employees have that they will be paid accurately and on time? And he said, I would love to promise that. I was like, oof, okay. Maybe get somewhere you can promise that. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
That's unacceptable.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't go into business and not be able to pay your workers. So I think he was quoted saying he has almost $1 million in debt.
That might be associated with the property versus the restaurant. You know what I mean?
Got it. But yes, hopefully some lessons have been learned. And is there anything, you'll be keeping an eye out for as the months go past here?
I want to know if late night is going to be coming back. If they reopen, I feel like the conflict there with Moxie right next door, it was like a peak almost immediately. Like it was a conflict right away where like apparently Moxie was comping rooms to people who were angry. If you go on to like Google reviews, you can see all the people who are mad about that weekend. And I'm like, okay. And John even said like they had to comp a bunch of like hotel rooms there. Moxie built at a time when it was quiet, but it's not quiet. And John also mentioned, and I don't know if this is a reasonable thing to expect, but that he was told there weren't going to be people sleeping on that little stretch, that side of East Wash. And in 2017, 2018, he really like tried to figure out the right level of sound so that the galaxy and the constellation across the street would not be bothered by the sound of late night. Mm-hmm. And he's like, oh yeah, I met with this, the city like 18 times. The city attorney came, and I really get the sense that they like tried very hard to find something that worked for everybody. And I don't know now with Moxie being next door, and Moxie, it's owned by Marriott. It's billing itself as like this fun party hotel, but also sleeping is great.
Right. The perennial Madison conversation about loudness. Yeah.
And growth.
Work with your neighbors and growth. And that is really an area that's grown so much. And Lindsay, I appreciate you so much. We appreciate you coming on and sharing in the thoughtful way that you did about, what is going on with Robinia Courtyard, why it closed, and, some of the issues wrapped up in that. And we'll probably come to you for an update at some point. So.
All right. Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lindsay. That's Lindsay Christians, food editor at the Cap Times. If you want to learn more about the story, head to our show notes for a link to Lindsay's reporting. That's all for today, here on CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin. If you enjoyed the show, why not share this episode with someone you know who works in or has worked in the Madison restaurant scene? All right, we'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories and news from around the city. Until then, take very good care.